So my name is Peter Miner, and I'm a vehicle enthusiast with a background in electrical and electronics engineering, and I've done mechanical engineering.
Before he became Africa's most dangerous engineer, he just wanted his car to work. Buried in the heart of Kenya, one man is quietly pulling off what billion-dollar automakers still can't, turning broken-down engines from the 1960s into modern, fuel-efficient powerhouses, using a custom-built device no one saw coming. No labs, no Silicon Valley hype, just pure African ingenuity. Across Africa, aging engines are a crisis. Millions of vehicles abandoned, not because they're broken, but because the world gave up on them. But this engineer didn't. And now, governments are scrambling, collectors are stunned, mechanics are calling it the most important invention since fuel injection. How does one homemade device beat global tech giants? Why are drivers across 3 continents desperate to get it? And could this become Africa's biggest automotive breakthrough ever? The tinkerer who refused to quit. Peter Mberia didn't set out to become an inventor. He just wanted his car to work. In the early 2000s, he bought a 1984 Mercedes-Benz W201, a solid classic build, mechanical, reliable, or so he thought. But like many vintage cars, the system under the hood was running on borrowed time. Specifically, a carbureted setup that was notorious for fuel waste and hard starts. Peter wasn't an automotive engineer, not yet. He was a man with a background in electronics, a stubborn streak, and a deep respect for machines. He did what any good owner would do. He tuned it. He cleaned the jets. He replaced the float bowl. And when that didn't work, he swapped out the entire carburetor, twice, then a third time. But the fuel economy kept spiraling. At its worst, he was burning nearly 13,000 Kenyan shillings in fuel every month, just to keep the car on the road. Eventually, it became too much. Peter parked it. For nearly a year, it sat silent, a monument to frustration and failure. An engine swap was out of the question. Swapping in a more modern M111 engine might have solved the problem, but it would cost over 100,000 shillings, and Peter had already overhauled his original engine. Economically, emotionally, and practically. Abandoning the W201 wasn't an option. It wasn't just about the money, it was about pride. This was his car. This was his problem. And now it would become his mission. That failure became the blueprint for something world-changing. Not just for Peter, but for the millions of drivers like him who were quietly losing hope. But fixing an old car takes more than passion. It takes something radical, and Peter was about to build it from scratch. Building the Frankenstein engine. It started with a guinea pig engine, one that Peter bought specifically to experiment with. It was the first time he stopped trying to fix his car and started trying to understand it. He began stripping the system down to its bones. No more patches, no more temporary fixes. This was about reinvention. Chaos reigned. Wires tangled like spaghetti. Injectors misfired in erratic bursts. Circuits blew without warning. It looked less like a machine and more like a mess of broken ideas. But then something shifted. Patterns began to surface. Order clawed its way out of the wreckage. He began swapping fuel injectors, testing models from Toyota, then Nissan, then Mercedes-Benz. He watched how they behaved under different pressures. He mapped fuel delivery curves manually, checking flow rates and spray angles. Every failed start taught him something new. He designed and redesigned circuit boards by hand. He studied pulse width modulation and built his own control logic. This wasn't a repair. It was resurrection by engineering. At one point, he managed to get fuel delivery working, but the timing was off. The engine sputtered. It ran lean. Then it flooded. He realized he couldn't control performance unless he controlled ignition. That meant he had to master something deeper: spark timing, dwell angles, coil characteristics. That was when the tinkerer became an engineer. The failures taught him more than any textbook ever could. Each wrong turn became a stepping stone. He wasn't building a product, he was building a future. And it still needed one critical component. Fuel alone couldn't save the engine. What Peter needed next was spark, and that meant an entirely new kind of breakthrough: the ignition breakthrough. The ignition system in most old cars relies on a single coil and a mechanical distributor. It's primitive, it's imprecise, and it's wildly inefficient. For Peter to truly modernize his W201, he had to replace the very heart of its ignition logic. So he threw it out, completely. He introduced a coil-on plug system. Instead of one coil firing for all cylinders, each spark plug would now have its own dedicated coil. This allowed for individual control over ignition timing, something unheard of in old carbureted engines. He designed a new custom board to handle the signal processing. He learned dwell time calculation from scratch, how long to charge each coil, how to phase it perfectly with the engine's rotation, and how to adapt dynamically based on throttle position and temperature. Now, for the first time, Peter had full digital control over both fuel and ignition. The result? A Frankenstein engine that no longer behaved like a relic. It ran smoother. It started faster. It burned cleaner. It responded like a modern engine. Because mechanically, it was. For the first time, an old African engine roared like it was brand new. And Peter didn't just prove something to himself. He proved it to every mechanic who said it couldn't be done. Every engineer who said the systems were incompatible. Every driver who had given up hope. But the real test wouldn't be under a hood in a lab. The real test was what happened when he hit the streets. And the world started paying attention. We spent weeks tracing Peter's breakthroughs, verifying the tech, watching the test runs, and decoding every wiring diagram he built from scratch. Now you get a shortcut to one of the most important engineering revolutions you've never heard of. If this earned your respect, subscribe and drop a comment. We read everyone. The first road test goes public. Peter and Beria had spent years behind the curtain, tinkering, debugging, failing quietly. But everything changed the day he finally installed his custom Voltarant ECU into his own 1984 Mercedes-Benz W201. For the first time, this aging relic wasn't just functioning. It was purring like a brand new German machine. The ignition was crisp, the throttle response was instantaneous, and the fuel consumption was already showing signs of dropping significantly. But the breakthrough wasn't just technical. It was about to become very, very public. He recorded a simple video, no flashy edits, no sales pitch, just the sound of an old engine breathing like it was born yesterday. He explained what he had done, showed the live engine data from his laptop, and captured the drive in real time. He uploaded the video to his social media accounts, mostly to share with a small circle of fellow gearheads and skeptics. But the reaction exploded almost immediately. Comments began flooding in. Wait, what system is this? How is that FD engine running that smooth? Can you fix mine? The video didn't go fully viral by internet standards, but in the world of vintage car enthusiasts and DIY mechanics, it might as well have been a sensation. Local automotive forums picked it up. WhatsApp groups buzzed with excitement. Mechanics who had written off these older models as impossible to modernize were suddenly reevaluating everything they thought they knew. Within days, Peter was getting messages from across Kenya and then beyond. People with aging Peugeots, Toyota Crowns, and Land Rovers wanted the same miracle. "Can you do it on my car?" they asked. "When can I come to Thika?" What started as a viral garage fix quickly became something much bigger, because as Peter's engine roared to life, so did a solution to one of Africa's most urgent problems: pollution. Turning pollution into progress. Environmental regulations have long been the enemy of classic cars. Around the world, governments are cracking down on emissions, imposing strict limits on tailpipe pollution, and pushing for rapid adoption of electric vehicles. In theory, this sounds great, but in practice, it threatens to wipe out entire generations of cars that still have life left in them, especially in Africa, where infrastructure for electric vehicles remains years behind. That's where Voltarant changes the conversation. Peter's ECU doesn't just improve performance, it slashes emissions. By introducing electronic precision to previously analog engines, the system eliminates unnecessary fuel burning. It cuts idling fuel waste. It adjusts injection timing dynamically. It even includes drive modes like Eco and Eco Plus, which lean out the fuel-air ratio during cruising. These changes may sound small, but collectively, they have a massive environmental impact. One of his goals from day one was to reduce the carbon footprint of older vehicles without forcing owners to scrap their engines or buy costly new hybrids. And he's succeeding. Vehicles that once barely passed emissions inspections are now exceeding modern thresholds. Local governments are starting to notice. Policymakers are exploring incentives to retrofit public transport fleets. Some taxi cooperatives have already begun trials. What makes this even more remarkable is how minimal the sensor suite is. Peter's system doesn't rely on dozens of expensive components. It works with just a few: throttle position, camshaft location, manifold pressure, and coolant temperature. This makes it affordable, easy to install, and incredibly adaptable to different engine types. A Kenyan engineer just leapfrogged the EV era with software, and now the rest of the world is starting to pay attention. Global demand, African supply. From Nairobi to Newfoundland, his inbox exploded. The first time Peter posted a full road test of his W201 powered by the Voltarant ECU, it wasn't just fellow mechanics who paid attention. Curious engineers, struggling classic car owners, and even a handful of auto parts resellers began flooding his messages. And not just from Kenya. By the end of the first week, Peter had received inquiries from South Africa, India, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada. What started as a personal experiment was now a global conversation, and Peter was at the center of it. But demand alone wasn't enough. These weren't just plug-and-play units that could be shipped in bulk like phone chargers. Every ECU kit had to be matched with the specific quirks: injector layout, sensor availability, and firing order of each customer's vehicle, whether it was a Mercedes-Benz W123 in Zambia or a Datsun pickup in Pakistan. Peter had to develop custom-fit solutions. He wasn't just an engineer anymore. He was a logistics master, a consultant, and sometimes even a teacher. His remote diagnostic support quickly became legendary. Customers would send WhatsApp videos showing engine startups, strange misfires, or fuel cutoffs. Peter would pause his work, review the footage, mark timestamps, and send back annotated voice notes. If the harness wasn't seated correctly or a sensor wire was misrouted, he would walk them through the fix in real time, sometimes while riding in a Matatu between towns. For many customers, it felt like having a world-class engineer riding shotgun in their garage. He even began creating instructional walkthroughs in local dialects, ensuring customers in different countries didn't just receive a product, they received confidence. This wasn't just a transaction, it was a transfer of skill. And that mattered, because these were not rich customers tinkering for fun. These were working families trying to keep their only vehicle alive. For them, Peter's ECU didn't just improve an engine, it restored their livelihood. By focusing on mechanical compatibility, on real-world fitment rather than flashy specs, Peter cracked the code that so many Western tech firms missed. He didn't over-design, he didn't overwhelm. He listened, adjusted, and adapted. And in doing so, he proved something quietly radical: that African engineering could not only meet global demand, it could shape it. And the global response was only the beginning. Because while the world was watching, many still refused to believe. And before Peter's work could reach its next level, it almost came to a halt. Doubt, burnout, and breakthrough. He almost gave up. Then came the phone call that changed everything. At one point, Peter had spent 3 straight months debugging the same issue on 3 different vehicles. All had strange injector misfires. All were from different regions, and none followed the ECU's expected behavior. The more he worked, the more tangled it got. He stopped sleeping, stopped socializing. His bank account barely stayed afloat. The solder fumes were making him dizzy. And worst of all, the doubt began to creep in. Maybe I don't have what it takes. Then, one night, just as he was packing up another failed board, the phone rang. It was a customer from Eldoret, someone Peter barely remembered speaking to. His voice cracked through the receiver. "Peter," he said, "this thing saved my family." The man explained how their delivery van, once a fuel-guzzling nightmare, had become the backbone of their small business. With the Voltarant ECU, they could run double routes. They no longer feared breakdowns. They were finally making money. And now he wanted to install ECUs on his cousin's cars, his church's vehicle, maybe even start a business of his own. Peter dropped the board, not in shock, but in recognition. All the months of failed code, of wrong voltage maps, of sleepless nights, they weren't wasted. They were investments, and the return wasn't just technical, it was human. That call didn't just lift him, it reset him. Because now he understood. He wasn't building gadgets, he was building trust, community, continuity. From that moment forward, the vision grew bigger than himself. And with that clarity, Peter began designing not just for function, but for the future. A new blueprint for African tech. He didn't just make an ECU, he made a model for every future innovator. Voltarent wasn't a one-man garage project anymore. It was a lab, a proving ground, a mentorship engine. Peter started hiring apprentices from local polytechnics, not just to help solder or debug, but to understand, design, and build. He created a structure where experimentation was not just allowed, but required. If a student suggested a better way to route the harness, Peter didn't correct them, he gave them the table. Because Voltarent wasn't just a company, it was a framework, a declaration that Africa's problems could be solved by African minds, with no permission required. And his philosophy went deeper. Repair, don't replace, wasn't just a mantra. It was resistance. Resistance to the global throwaway culture. Resistance to planned obsolescence. Resistance to the belief that innovation must mean new, expensive, and foreign. Voltarent proved that with the right design, even an engine from the 1970s could outperform one built last week. Soon, Peter's influence extended beyond engines. He began sketching concepts for low-cost inverters, solar battery controllers, even retrofitted electric hubs for bicycles. The platform was expanding, because what he had built wasn't just a product, it was a manifesto. He showed the world that the best tech doesn't always come in glossy packaging. Sometimes it's etched onto a simple PCB board, powered by perseverance, and mailed across the globe from a small desk in Thika. But that desk, it was no longer just a workspace. It had become the launchpad for a movement, the battle of the ECUs. Most electronic control units in the automotive world are a mess of unnecessary sensors, overpriced components, and user-unfriendly design. That's not an exaggeration. It's the reality mechanics and tuners face when they deal with aftermarket ECUs. Most are built for niche, high-performance markets or overly modernized vehicles. But Peter Mberia's Voltarent ECU doesn't follow that script. It isn't bloated, it isn't expensive, and it certainly isn't overcomplicated. It's engineered with a single principle: keep it lean, keep it smart, and keep it accessible. Unlike Bosch or Haltech systems, which often require upwards of 20 separate sensors to operate efficiently, the Voltarent ECU can run a classic engine with as few as 4. It needs only engine temperature, manifold absolute pressure, camshaft position, and throttle position. That's it. No oxygen sensors, no fuel pressure sensors, no crankshaft timing input. Peter understood that many owners of older vehicles don't have the technical ability or access to integrate advanced digital systems, and he met them where they are. He designed something that works with what already exists. Let's be clear, this isn't a cheap workaround. It's a refined system, custom-built to outperform legacy ECUs in specific use cases. The Voltarent ECU is especially powerful in vehicles from the 1960s through the early 2000s, cars with aging mechanical systems that can't run on newer bloated platforms. When comparing its flexibility to platforms like AEM Infinity or Haltech Elite, Peter's ECU wins in simplicity, cost, and adaptability. Those other systems demand full rewiring, sensor upgrades, and sometimes even engine swaps. Voltarent, by contrast, adapts to the vehicle, not the other way around. It gets better. Every Voltarent ECU can be tuned live with a laptop. Peter built custom software that shows real-time data, revs, throttle response, fuel mapping, and ignition timing. The feedback is immediate. If something's off, it can be adjusted on the fly. No costly tuning shops. No complicated firmware updates. Just data, adjustments, and results, live. What makes the Voltarent ECU even more remarkable is that it doesn't demand sacrifice. It doesn't trade reliability for performance, or vice versa. Peter found a middle ground that the industry long ago abandoned in pursuit of complexity. With fewer points of failure and a clearer design philosophy, the Voltarent ECU has proven itself smarter, not just smaller. This was never just a war of specifications. Peter was fighting for something far bigger than sensor counts or spark timing. He was fighting for memory. He was fighting for legacy. And that's where the next chapter begins, saving history, one car at a time. This isn't just engineering, it's restoration of identity. All across Africa, and increasingly the world, classic cars are more than machines. They are generational artifacts. Peugeot 504s, early Toyota Land Cruisers, Mercedes 123s. They aren't simply transport, they are heirlooms. Passed from father to son, kept alive in dusty workshops and red dirt villages. They are symbols of resilience, self-reliance, and pride. But until Peter came along, they were also at risk of disappearing forever. When governments began tightening emissions regulations and parts suppliers stopped manufacturing spares, these old cars were sentenced to death, not because they were worn out, but because they were outdated. That's where Peter's work flipped the narrative. His Voltarent ECU didn't just modernize engines, it preserved stories. It gave families a way to keep their history running, literally. One collector from Nakuru restored a 1979 Peugeot 504 that belonged to his grandfather. The engine, once running on a carburetor that gulped fuel and misfired constantly, now starts instantly and runs smoother than many modern compacts. Another story came from a family in Mombasa who had a Toyota Crown that had been parked for over a decade. Mechanics had given up on it. Peter installed the Voltarent ECU, did a full wiring harness, and 3 days later, the engine purred to life. It was like hearing our father speak again, the owner said. These stories aren't isolated, they're spreading. All across Kenya, and now in parts of Zambia, Nigeria, Tanzania, and even the Middle East, people are reaching out not for performance upgrades, but for resurrection. Peter's invention allows them to bring the dead back to life. It turns rusty, silent icons into daily drivers again. And more than that, it lets people keep a piece of who they are. This isn't about nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. This is about survival. When people are priced out of new vehicles, when electric mandates don't match infrastructure, and when imports fail to adapt to local terrain, the only solution is to modernize what's already here. Peter's ECU doesn't just give people that option. It dignifies it. Still, one question lingered. Would governments recognize the value of a grassroots invention? That answer came faster than anyone expected. Governments take notice. They had planned for electric. Every policy, every import restriction, every green initiative was centered on battery-powered vehicles. But Peter gave them something they hadn't seen coming: a faster, cheaper path to modernization. The response wasn't immediate, but when it came, it was loud. In early 2023, regional authorities in Kenya began issuing inquiries about large-scale retrofit options. A new emissions directive had forced many public and private fleets off the road. That's when Voltarent entered the equation. Peter's ECU caught the attention of government procurement officers looking for realistic solutions. Suddenly, Voltarent wasn't just a passion project. It was a potential pillar of national transport. Retrofits for taxis, school buses, government pickups, and agricultural fleets became a viable alternative to mass vehicle scrappage. With emissions readings that fell within Euro 3 and Euro 4 standards, Peter's system qualified under most transitional policies for clean air compliance. Soon after, government-funded pilot programs were initiated in Nakuru and Eldoret. Peter and his growing team began training municipal mechanics on how to install the kits. He developed region-specific packages, pre-configured for common engines like the Nissan TD, Toyota 2L, and Isuzu 4JB. These weren't prototypes. They were production-ready solutions, built and shipped from his modest workshop in Thika. But interest wasn't limited to Kenya. Inquiries began flowing in from Uganda, Ethiopia, and even municipalities in India looking for affordable retrofit solutions. Peter was invited to technical expos, green innovation forums, and received early support from local tech investors. One workshop, once laughed at by policy elites, was now shaping transport strategies. Voltarant became more than a product. It became a blueprint for how Africa could modernize on its own terms, without relying on Western imports or unrealistic infrastructure rollouts. But for Peter, all of this was never about fame. It was about something quieter, something deeper, the legacy of a reluctant genius. He didn't want to be famous. He just wanted his car to work. That's the part people forget when they hear the story of Peter Imberia. This wasn't some venture-backed startup born in a lab. This was a man in his 30s, in a rented workshop in Tika, chasing a solution to a personal problem. And in solving that problem, he created something the world desperately needed. Today, his vision is expanding. He now offers mentorship to engineering students and tinkerers across Africa. Voltarant has evolved into more than an ECU. It's a platform for learning, for building, for reclaiming control over one's technology. Peter shares his schematics with trusted partners, trains installers remotely, and dreams of launching a hardware incubator to help others do what he did: solve real problems with locally built solutions. Testimonials are pouring in. One mechanic in Lusaka said the Voltarant ECU saved his shop from closing. A car enthusiast in Alberta, Canada, used it to resurrect a rare JDM import that no longer had part support. A mechanic in Karachi installed it in a Nissan Patrol with a blown-out distributor and turned it into a daily driver. Peter's idea, once small enough to fit on a breadboard, is now big enough to span continents. But the man himself remains unchanged. When asked what drives him, he gives the same answer every time: "I just didn't want to throw away my engine." That humility, the idea that greatness can emerge from personal necessity, is what makes this story so powerful. In a world obsessed with novelty, Peter Imberia reminds us that sometimes the future is hidden inside the past. All it takes is someone brave enough to unlock it. And so, with a single invention, he's given the world something it didn't know it was missing: a second chance for every engine, and every person who still believes they can fix what others gave up on. Peter didn't just rebuild his car, he rewired the future. If this story moved you even a little, comment your favorite moment and subscribe so we can keep telling them.